Hello all, and thank you for joining me. I'm Michaëla de Lacaze Mohrmann, and I curated Born of Informalismo, Marta Minujín and the Nascent Body of Performance, an exhibition at ISLAA that centers on Minujín's informalist paintings and sculptures from the early 1960s. As this exhibition traces, Minujín used Informalismo's decrepit materials to think through the body's vulnerability, a meditation that was in part a response to Latin America's poverty and political violence, and that eventually led Minujín to become a pioneer of performance art in Argentina. My presentation today builds on the show's exploration of bodily destruction by examining Informalismo's gender politics specifically. To start, I turn to a 1961 article written by the influential Argentine critic Jorge Romero Berest. In this key text, vaguely titled On Informalismo, Berest struggles to define this movement, which has been the talk of Buenos Aires since 1958. The immediacy of Informalismo's non-artistic materials, Berest believes, puts this style of art beyond words. Its canvases offer what he calls experiences that cannot be theorized. Even naming the movement is difficult. Berest rejects the numerous foreign nomenclature, art brut, art autre, action painting, art informel, etc. Instead, he proposes two terms of his own invention, arte inconstructivo and arte virginal, or inconstructive art and virginal art, respectively. Dissatisfied with these two neologisms, he refrains from explaining them, but we can still infer his reasoning. Inconstructive art underscores through its prefix that Informalismo is the logical negation of Argentina's constructive art. Presumably, this is because its messy, gestural surfaces, connoting unbridled emotions and even madness, refute the rational control and mathematical precision prized by the concrete vanguards of the 1940s. By contrast, Berest's second term for Informalismo, virginal art, suggests not a dialectical evolution, but a total erasure or ignorance of the past. Virginal art evokes a clean slate, a domain not yet known or shaped by man. And I do mean man. For at its core, this metaphorical construct implicates the body in an undeniably masculinist way by analogizing painting to a chaste maiden. Like a virgin bride, the untouched blank canvas awaits the explorations and manipulations of the painter, presumably a man. Recognizing that Informalismo was early on theorized through such covert phallocentric fantasies enables us to understand the predicament of women painters within this movement. Note that the term virginal art casts creation as a sort of deflowering, but that this titillating scenario slips into being a more brutal despoiling when we consider the violently trashed surfaces of most informalist paintings. I give you here the work of two leading Argentine informalists, Alberto Greco and Kenneth Campbell. To be sure, both Greco and Campbell greatly esteemed and supported women artists. Campbell acknowledged his debt to informalist artist Silvia Toras, whose guidance was central to his practice, while Greco was a mentor and friend to Minujín, who dedicated one of her early informalist paintings to him. Nonetheless, the shock value of Greco's late informalist painting, The Murdered Nun, derives from its explicit declaration that a chaste female body has been savagely defiled and killed. In the sacrilegious work presented at Galeria Pizarro in 1961, a white shirt is slathered in paint and nailed to the canvas. Its sleeves droop beyond the frame as if to conjure the limp body of a Christian martyr. At the time, the effect was so potent that viewers continued to see what one reporter described as horribly miserable, disheveled figures in the show's 6 other paintings, even though these works were fully abstract, all-black canvases. The Murdered Nun stunned Ignacio Pirovano, an influential collector and the founding director of the National Museum of Decorative Art. After seeing the work, he writes to Greco, The anguish of childbirth dominates us, and your painting is a birth where pains are synthesized as an atrocious scream. Here, the death of a nun who has renounced procreation is paradoxically yoked to the life-giving maternal body in the act of labor. Drawing from the existentialism then in vogue, Pirovano locates the merit of Greco's work in its capacity to capture the angst of existence by synthesizing precisely what bookends it: birth and death, creation and destruction. Strikingly, the synthesis requires using the body of woman as its vehicle. This motif of the canvas as an agonizing yet generative female body persisted into Greco's late work, such as his 1964 painting, Incarnation, Heredia's Suffering Woman. Kemble's 1958 painting, Pequeñas Reglas de Conducta, similarly conflates creation and destruction through allusions to the female figure. Here, a painting's surface appears to rend itself before our eyes. This drama is heightened as we approach the canvas and realize that the torn layers of fabric are not the canvas itself, but rather ripped women's underwear. Though fully abstract, Kemble's painting gestures to a violently denuded female figure and is therefore a key antecedent for Greco's Murdered Nun. Moreover, his title, which translates to Little Rules of Conduct, is a double entendre. Reglas, the word for rules in Spanish, also colloquially means menstruation. The title, therefore, broadly gestures to all the societal codes and stigmas strictly regulating women's bodies, especially their sexualities and reproductive systems. Yet any allusion to bodily creation is undeniably overtaken by a sense of violence and destruction in this work. In light of the canvas's shredded surface, Little Rules of Conduct becomes a somewhat ironic title implying impropriety, the breaking of rules. Prominent stains and blotchiness of red paint conjure not only menstruation, but also murder, rape, or some other traumatic event in a woman's life, a back alley abortion, perhaps. The work's potency therefore resides in its ability to convert the viewer's dispassionate observation of abstract forms into a charged, almost perverse scrutiny of an unknown woman's intimate clothing and implied suffering. That this scopolithic mode develops gradually and surreptitiously without the viewer's initial knowledge redoubles the sense of violation permeating the painting. Kemble's later works continued to analogize the art object with the body of woman even more explicitly. In works such as the 1960 relief Prohibited, which in Spanish is prohibida, so gendered as feminine, Kemble presents a vagina dentata, an age-old trope that reduces woman to its reproductive organ, conflating her potential for life and pleasure with death and pain. The destruction it intimates is, of course, male castration, a testament to men's persistent and often misogynistic anxieties about women. The vagina dentata reappeared in immediate offshoots of informalist art, most notably the work of Arte Destructivo, an artist collective formed by Kemble and several other informalist artists, including Silvia Torres. We therefore might ask, what role could a woman painter possibly play in Informalismo, a movement that frequently codified painting in such phallocentric terms? If leading male artists and critics were equating the informalist canvas to the body of woman as either a passive receptacle of male aggression, a threat to the male viewer, or a spectacle of female suffering, did women informalists reconfigure this paradigm? And if so, how? The informalist work of Marta Minujín offers one answer, for it articulates a type of bodily destruction that is not predicated on the spectacle of gendered violence. In the late 1950s, Minujín, who was still a teenager, took her first steps as an artist by sketching the ill and aging who visited her father's medical practice. She would also draw those living without shelter on the streets, inviting them into her family home to her parents' dismay. Considering that Minujín older brother succumbed to leukemia in 1957, her preternatural interest in the ravages of disease cannot be misinterpreted as a form of detached voyeurism. My parents were destroyed, she recalls. She too struggled with this loss. She cut her hands to the point of scarring them, but also turned to art and writing. One of her poems from that time reads, "Listen to me, death, you who closes life to relieve vain burdens and rob of matter these human souls, you who fills your hands with bodies so withered, you holder of the inert." These verses are striking for their emphasis on the materiality of the body, its weight, fragility, and eventual inertness. Matter reappears as a core preoccupation in Minujín's 1961 statement on her informalist art, published for her first solo show at Galeria Lirolai. She writes, "Matter, a means of expression, has liberated its forces. Without illustrating anything, it permits the informalist artist to structure the surface of painting until reaching a space of possible modifications where things, day by day, fragment themselves and disappear." Unsurprisingly, her informalist paintings are dense works made of sand, carpenter's glue, hardboard, and oils. Yet they are also brittle. Their surfaces bear cracks and mildew-like stains suggestive of decay. A key work in this series is Testimony for a Young Tomb, which Minujín sent to the Second Paris Biennial in the fall of 1961. The work's title is most likely an oblique reference to Minujín's prematurely deceased brother. What interests me here is the way that the painting refuses to do violence to the body, as we have seen with other informalist canvases. Testimony for a Young Tomb refrains from putting the destruction of the body on display. As a whole, the work's forms are staid and sober. A tomb, after all, marks as much as it conceals the horror of the body turned corpse. In this sense, the grave is a respectful and caring form of shelter that blocks vision, shielding both the deceased and the viewer. This notion of shelter for the body quickly became central to Minujín's ensuing series of sculptures, the cartones and cardboards, which she began creating while wintering in Paris between 1961 and 63. Bearing an informalist aesthetic, but also in dialogue with the object-based art of Nouveau Realisme, these works were made with cardboard boxes that Minujín culled from dumpsters. She also purchased cardboard from trash pickers and houseless individuals who used these boxes as makeshift shelter. In December 1961, she writes, "I woke up at 7 a.m. to buy cardboard that the clochards lifted from the streets. To buy the cardboard, I had to enter a large ramshackle house, which appeared to have been inhabited since the times of the Bastille. Old women with no teeth, dirty, sold their cardboards, and young women with even older gazes. I got out filled with fear." Minujín's sensitivity to the plight of impoverished women, young and old, is unsurprising. Though to a lesser degree, she too was living a penurious existence. Her diaries repeatedly describe her lack of money, poor diet, and inadequate housing while in Paris. Without a raincoat or umbrella, she was perpetually drenched and cold. She inhabited a slew of apartments, each with its own special drawbacks. One lacked heating, while another had no bathroom. Her first dwelling, where she created the bulk of her cartones, was a small maid's room that doubled as her studio. To find room to paint, she dragged the furniture in and out of the bathroom. The resulting noise, coupled with the unsightly boxes she dragged up the building's 5 flights of stairs, jeopardized her housing. These living conditions, which forced Minujín to breathe the noxious fumes of her freshly painted sculptures, quickly poisoned her. Her diary recounts, "I woke up at 4 a.m., believing I was going crazy. My entire body was itching. I felt that if I did not scratch myself, I would die. My head itched, my shoulders, my hands, my eyes, my feet. Maddened, I got up, undid the bed, wet myself, and powdered myself with talc. And when I saw myself in the mirror, what horror! I was full of red hives, and my eyes were 2 balls, swollen like never before. I had horrible palpitations. I was a monster." Yet, Minujín continued to use the industrial paints she prized for her art. 2 weeks later, she writes, I sleep in a room with the smell of glue and paint that makes others faint, but I do not sense it. She soon began to lose her vision, however. Unresponsive to prescribed medications, the infection in her eyes worsened over the next month. I cannot paint nor read with these eyes that burn. I see foggy, she writes in January of 1962. Unsurprisingly, the resulting cartones appealed less to the eye than to the sense of touch. Because of these works' all-black surfaces, viewers were drawn to differences in texture, to surface accidents and irregularities that could best be ascertained through the fingers. By preserving some of her box's angular articulations, Minujín created sculptures with multiple protuberances and cavities that invited exploration with the body, an impression reinforced by the many photos capturing Minujín contorting herself inside her works. Depending on the lighting, these cavities could turn into deep pockets of shadows, frustrating to vision. Alternatively, they could open up onto the surrounding space, diverting the eye away from the work and back towards the room. Minujín's rickety and asymmetrical sculptures were also assembled in a seemingly perfunctory manner that preserved the instability and transience of the cardboard's past function as shelter for the houseless. There was, in other words, something both inviting and repellent about these works. One could sense that they had always existed in close proximity to human bodies, the artists, the pores, but that this was a pained rapport. Minujín's Colchones, a second series of cardboard sculptures incorporating discarded hospital mattresses, would heighten this torturous relationship to the body through their paradoxical suggestion of comfort and their potential for infection. Because of Minujín's unwavering commitment to her art, illness and suffering became a necessary part of her informalist practice. Self-destruction as a form of creation would, of course, become an even more prominent theme in her performative art, notably her 1963 happening, The Destruction. But at this stage of her oeuvre, it also amounted to a complete reframing of Informalismo's masculinist conception of the canvas as an eroticized femicide. With her cartones, the suffering female body was kept behind the scenes and off the work. Significantly, Minujín was not a victim of violence as much as a consciously self-sacrificing agent testing her own limits. Her journal entries make this clear. Cohabitation with painting is tough, she writes, especially because I don't know who will be the transformed one, me or it. Her words frame her misery not so much as an assault to be endured in total passivity, but as a combat between herself and her art. Everything is hanging in the balance, especially her identity as an artist. In fact, Minujín had always been fully cognizant of the challenges she would face in Paris. Before departing for the capital, she had written, I do not accept comfortable armchairs nor warm meals. I am wounded by the arrow of liberty. Bleeding my contradictions, I want to cleanse our heads of prejudice and morality. Undo the chain of men marked by the same ambition. These are the words of a courageous and determined person. Minujín perceives the sacrifices to come and deliberately hardens herself by writing these words. Her goal is to be the match of the equally ambitious men who came before her and to insert herself, a woman artist, in this unbroken chain of men. Her fight would be a hard one, exacerbated by misogyny. Within 2 weeks of her arrival to Paris, Minujín gripes, I'd like to meet more people, but here, if you speak to anyone, they see you only as a woman, not as an artist or intellectual. She also noticed that her male peers had more resources and support than her. After spending an evening with Luis Felipe Noé and Jorge de la Vega, who could be productive in their very spacious studios, Minujín reports, I became gripped with horrible anxiety because of how well they painted. When I returned home, I destroyed with fury the 3 paintings I had. Her psychological distress triggered a nightmare that same evening. She recorded her dream in the following way. I gave birth to a cardboard child. I saw myself in the delivery room, surrounded by horrified doctors withdrawing black cardboard paintings from me. We have encountered this metaphor before in Pirovano's critical response to Greco's murdered nun. All the same ingredients are present: existential angst, a monstrous birth, and the conflation of creation and destruction. Yet, in the case of Minujín, this image symbolizes not artistic success as it did for Greco's gushing critic. Rather, it represents her potential failure as an artist, who cannot be seen as anything else than a woman, whose creative potential is believed to be limited to the biological. It is an image of her crushing understanding of what it means to live in patriarchy. Ultimately, Minujín won the battle against her toxic cohabitants. Her cartones and colchones were praised by both the French and Argentine press. Every critic detected the architectural and tortured quality of these works. Repeatedly, her sculptures were described as potent agents of contagion or traps for the public. The eminent Argentine critic Aldo Pellegrini, for example, described these works as lugubrious apparatus dwellings that, in his words, manifest a threat to the safety of the spectator. Minujín, in other words, redirected the violence that informalist painters had typically reserved for the canvas-turned woman. In her work, violence moved outwards to the viewer through an antagonistic art object. This antagonism would grow, pushing her object-based art into performance. In response to Argentina's military infighting, Minujín began adding military equipment such as soldiers' boots and hats to her cardboard works. In this way, her sculptures used an informalist idiom to capture the destruction of specifically male bodies, not femicide, but fratricide. For her 1962 solo exhibition of these works at Galleria Lirolai, Minujín invited to the opening 80 soldiers from opposing factions. At her behest, they performed military drills. A sort of proto-happening, their presence ruptured the insularity of the art world by bringing the Civil War into the gallery space. The sight of Minujín, a 19-year-old woman controlling these soldiers, underscored the military's inconstancy and venality, the structural problems that were at the root of the Civil War. But it also subverted traditional gender norms, shocking those at the opening. In the exhibition catalog, Rafael Schirru praised Minujín for having the courage of a primordial female, to cite his exact words. He also compared her to Joan of Arc. Once again, the image of the Virgin resurfaces in Informalismo's discourse, but this time we are given a warrior virgin who leads armies of men into battle, only to be finally burned as a witch. There is perhaps a tacit admonition in this flattering comparison. To conclude, I'd like to return to Brest's criticism and end with another image. In 1963, Brest republished the 1961 article on Informalismo with which I opened this talk. Although only 2 years had passed, much had changed in Buenos Aires' art world. Informalismo had now given way to other forms of art, such as happenings and pop. Yet, Brest's text maintained his old position that Informalismo defied reason and explanation. To drive his point home, Brest adds the following new line. It is high time for Informalismo, the Cinderella of philosophy, to become aware of herself as such. His exasperation with Informalismo is perhaps understandable, but his choice of words should give us pause. As we have seen, Informalismo at times staged an exceptionally somatic experience for the viewer. Did this, however, truly push it past critical comprehension? What are the particular experiences conveyed by Informalismo that put Brest at a loss for words? The personification of Informalismo as Cinderella, a young woman who unjustly toils in filth and obscurity, is so close to capturing the predicament of most informalist women artists that Brest's words effect a return of the repressed. Indeed, Brest betrays himself, For the theoretical aphasia surrounding Informalismo, then, as much as now, is a willful one, an indifferent muteness that has long erased the experiences and contributions of Informalismo's women artists. Thank you.